The night before her wedding, Vivian Holt sat at the edge of her childhood bed and listened to the house settle around her. Her father was still awake. She could hear him moving through the study below, the slow drag of his chair, the soft thud of a book set down. She thought about going to him. She didn't. She had known about the arrangement since February. Her father had told her over breakfast, quietly, the way he told her most difficult things, without ceremony, as though the gravity of it might pass through her more gently if he didn't announce it first. The Mercer family. The eldest son, James. The estate would remain solvent. Her father would keep the house where she had grown up, where her mother had died, where the roses still came back every May despite no one tending them properly. She had nodded. She had finished her tea. What she had not done was ask whether James Mercer was a man she might eventually love. It hadn't seemed like the right question. James Mercer was 31 years old when he married Vivian Holt, and he brought to their marriage all the warmth of a man who had learned, early, that warmth was something to be rationed. He was not unkind. Vivian would understand that later. The distinction mattered. He was not unkind. He was simply absent, in the way a man can be absent while standing in the same room, eating at the same table, sleeping in the same house. His eyes moved past her rather than toward her. When she spoke, he listened in the way that politicians listen. His expression attentive, his thoughts elsewhere. The Mercer estate sat 12 miles outside of Savannah, Georgia, and in the spring of 1903, it was still impressive. Wide white columns. A long alley of live oaks leading up from the road, the kind of house that made strangers slow their carriages. James managed it with efficiency and without sentiment. He kept exact records. He knew the yield of every field, the cost of every repair, the name of every tenant family on the property. He simply did not know the name of the seamstress who had made his wife's wedding dress, or that Vivian had kept her mother's silver thimble in the small drawer of her dressing table, or that she did not take sugar in her coffee and had been served it with sugar every morning for 14 months. His mother, Mrs. Dorinda Mercer, noticed these things only to use them. She was a precise woman who wore black even in summer, who moved through her own household as though she were conducting an inspection. She had wanted James to marry the Caldecott girl. She had said so, not to Vivian directly, but in the way she said most things, at angles, with a faint smile, in rooms where Vivian happened to be standing. The Caldecott family, she said once. Not 3 weeks after the wedding, addressing her son across the dinner table, while Vivian sat between them, has always understood what it means to maintain a household of consequence. She lifted her water glass. But of course, different people bring different things. James said nothing. He reached for the salt. Vivian cut her meat into small, even pieces and looked at the pattern on her plate. She had decided, sometime between February and the wedding, that she would be adequate, not happy. She was not sentimental enough to expect happiness from an arrangement, but adequate. She would learn the house. She would learn his habits. She would be the kind of wife who did not require management. She thought, in her practical heart, that this was a reasonable exchange. Her compliance for his indifference, and they would both be spared the worse alternative, which was open suffering. What she had not prepared for was the particular loneliness of being ignored in public. It happened first at a dinner party hosted by the Whitmore family in March of their first year. James had been cornered by his old friend Arden, a loud, comfortable man who found everything amusing, and Vivian had been standing close enough to hear when Arden clapped James on the shoulder and said, grinning, "Well, Mercer, how does married life suit you?" James had smiled, the social version, the one that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "It is what it is, Arden. A man's got to have someone to manage the household." A pause. "Though I'll confess it's more complicated than I anticipated." Arden laughed. "Aren't they all?" Vivian did not move. She kept her expression pleasant. She was holding a glass of cold lemonade, and she could feel the condensation on her fingers, and she focused on that, the small present fact of it, while something in her chest closed like a door. She did not tell anyone what she had heard. There was no one to tell. Her name was Anselm. That was the housekeeper's name, Mrs. Anselm Doris, a stout woman from Charleston, who had served the Mercer household for 19 years, and who looked at Vivian for the first 3 months, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned not to attach herself to new wives until she knew whether they would last. By autumn, something had shifted. It was not warmth exactly, it was more like the granting of professional respect. "The winter stores, Mrs. Doris said one morning, setting the household ledger on the table in front of Vivian, "will need to be ordered before the end of October if we're to get ahead of the price increases." Vivian looked at the ledger. "Show me what was ordered last year." Mrs. Doris sat down across from her. It was the first time she had sat in Vivian's presence. Vivian noted it and said nothing. By December, Vivian understood the household accounts better than she had expected. She found inefficiencies, small ones, the kind that accumulate into significant losses over years, and she addressed them without fanfare. She renegotiated the contract with the feed merchant. She caught an error in the quarterly timber accounting that had been overpaying the supplier for 6 years. She did not mention any of this to James. He did not ask. She told herself she did not mind. She was useful. That was something. But in the evenings, when James retired to his study and she sat in the parlor with her embroidery, and the lamp turned low, she would sometimes set down her work and sit very still and try to remember the last time he had looked at her directly. Not past her, at her, she could not remember. She wasn't sure he ever had. There was a woman in town named Helen Baxter, recently widowed, beautiful in the uncomplicated way of women, who have never had to work very hard at being noticed. James had known her since childhood. He mentioned her occasionally, in passing, the way a man mentions something he believes is of no significance. At the Whitmore dinner, at the church social, Helen had said this. Helen had found that amusing. Helen always understood exactly what he meant. Vivian began to understand that Helen Baxter was the shape of everything she was not, in her husband's mind. Not because James loved Helen. She did not think he did, not precisely, but because Helen was effortless to him, and Vivian was a responsibility. The distinction, she had come to understand, was the whole of it. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Vivian's father died. He had been ill since autumn, and the end came in January, quietly, on a Tuesday morning, when the light through his bedroom window was gray and flat. Vivian sat with him through the night before, holding his hand, saying very little. He had always preferred that, the company of someone present, without the noise of someone trying to fill the silence. James came to the funeral. He stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands, and his expression correctly somber. He shook the hands of the appropriate people. He said the correct things. When they returned home, he asked if she needed anything, and she said no, and he went to his study. She went to her room and sat on the floor beside the bed, which she had not done since she was a child, and she stayed there for a very long time. It was 2 weeks after the funeral, while she was sorting through the boxes that had been sent from her father's house, that she found the letter. It was tucked inside a small leather journal she had given him the Christmas she was 16, a book he had apparently used not for writing, but for keeping things flat and safe. The letter was addressed to her in his handwriting. The seal was unbroken. She sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. Vivian, if you are reading this, then I have gone and taken most of the things I should have said with me, which was always my particular failing. I want you to know that I understood what you agreed to when I asked it of you. I want you to know that I have thought about it every day since. You were never a girl who needed a great deal of managing. That was something I relied on, and I should have told you that I was proud of it, rather than simply relying on it. Your mother had that same quality. I did not tell her often enough either, whatever the marriage has become, and I think I know something of what it has become, because I am your father and I have watched your face. I want you to know this. The land on the east side of Kessler Road is yours, not the estate's, yours. Your mother's family held it before the war. The deed is in the bottom drawer of my desk, in the green folder, behind the insurance papers. I had it put in your name when you were born. Do not let anyone take what is yours because you were too polite to claim it. With more love than I ever managed to show you, your father. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in her hands for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just holding it. Then she went to the small writing desk in the corner of her room and began to work out what she knew about land valuations in Chatham County. It took her 6 months to do it quietly. The land her father had left her was 73 acres of good timber and better river access than most of the properties in the county. She did not announce this. She did not consult James. She had a lawyer in Savannah, a man named Percival Graves, who had handled her mother's small estate years before, and who looked at her across his desk with the faint surprise of a man who had not expected her to know what she was asking for, and she began to manage it. She sold the timber rights for 1 season, banking the income. She found a tenant farmer for the river-adjacent fields and negotiated a lease arrangement that was, Mr. Graves told her with something approaching admiration, rather more favorable than anything he himself would have proposed. She reinvested part of the income in improvements to the property boundary. She did not hide it from James exactly. She did not mention it. These were not the same thing. What changed, and it changed slowly enough that she could not have named the exact moment, was the quality of her silence. It had been, for 3 years, a suffering silence. It became, over those 6 months, a deliberate one. She was no longer waiting for James to see her. She was no longer arranging herself in the hope of being noticed. She was doing something, and the something belonged entirely to her, and that fact had a weight and a steadiness that nothing in the Mercer household had ever given her. She was still his wife. She made his household run. She sat across from him at dinner, and listened to him describe his meetings in town and responded appropriately and filled the space where a wife should be. But some essential part of her had quietly moved somewhere else, somewhere with better light, and she did not intend to move it back. The autumn of their 4th year, James came to her in the parlor one evening and stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. He had the look of a man who had been composing something on the way down the hall and was not entirely sure he'd gotten it right. "I heard something from Arden today," he said. She looked up from her correspondence. "Something about property near Kessler Road, some timber deal," he said. James stopped. "He seemed to think you'd arranged it." "I did," Vivian said. "My father left me the land. I've been managing it." The silence that followed was a specific kind. The kind that happens when a man realizes something has been happening in his peripheral vision for a considerable length of time. "You didn't mention it," he said finally. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I didn't." He stood there a moment longer. Something moved across his face. She had learned to read his face, over 4 years, in the absence of being offered anything more direct. It was not anger. It was more like the particular disorientation of a man who had believed, without ever examining the belief, that he knew the shape of his household, and had just discovered he did not. He went back to his study. He didn't bring it up again, but something had shifted. She noticed it in small ways first. He began to ask her, occasionally, about the Kessler Road property, not with great interest, but with more attention than he usually gave to anything she said. He started, for the first time in their marriage, to consult her about decisions rather than simply informing her of them. Once, at breakfast, he looked up from his newspaper and said, "You said last week the Braddock contract was overpriced. Were you right?" She had been. She told him the number. He nodded, folded the paper, and said nothing further. But he had asked. It should have been enough, she told herself. It was more than she'd had before. But she was 26 years old, and she had spent 4 years in a house where she was useful and invisible in equal measure. And the place inside her that had gone quiet was not. She was discovering actually quiet. It was simply waiting to see what she would do next. The dinner party was hosted at the Mercer estate that November. James's idea, 40 guests, a formal affair. Vivian had organized it entirely, down to the flowers on each table and the placement of people who did not get along in rooms that offered each other the widest possible berth. She had done this before. She was good at it. Helen Baxter was among the guests. Vivian watched James cross the room to her within 10 minutes of the evening beginning, watched him relax in that particular way. He never relaxed around his own wife, the shoulders dropping, the jaw unclenching. The ease of a man in the presence of something that required nothing of him. She watched and felt nothing she had not already felt before. That was the thing. It was not a new feeling. It was the same feeling she had been carrying for 4 years, and she had learned its dimensions exactly, the way you learn the dimensions of a room you've lived in long enough. She knew where all the furniture was. She did not trip over it anymore. But she also knew, standing in her own home in the dress she had chosen with no one to say whether she looked well in it, watching her husband be easy with another woman, that she was 30 years old in February. 30 years old. And she was tired. Not the tired that sleep fixes. The other kind. She told James in January, on a Wednesday afternoon, in the parlor, with the winter light coming flat through the windows and a fire that had burned down to coals because neither of them had thought to tend it. She did not raise her voice. She had rehearsed this enough times that the rehearsal itself had worn the emotion down to something manageable. Something she could say clearly. "I think we should separate," she said. "The arrangement is not working for either of us, though I suspect you've been less aware of that than I have." He looked up from the letter he'd been reading. He set it down. "I'm not asking for anything that isn't mine," she continued. "I don't want to make this difficult. The Kessler Road property is mine by deed. I have income from it sufficient for my needs. I'd like to go to my father's house, my house, now, since he left it to me. And I'd like to do so without anyone making it a matter of scandal if that can possibly be helped." James was quiet for a long moment. She had expected argument. She had expected the particular variety of protest that men offer when something they haven't valued is removed. The sudden discovery of feeling, the recalculation of worth. He said, "Is this about Helen?" It was not a question quite. "No," she said. and meant it. It's about the last 4 years. Another silence. He was looking at her in a way he had not often looked at her, directly, without the slight skew of his gaze that usually meant he was thinking about something else. She held it. I have not been, he started, and stopped. No, she said. You haven't. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She was very calm, she discovered. That was something she had not expected. She had expected to feel more, standing at this particular moment. Instead, she felt the particular lightness of someone who has set down a heavy thing and found the ground solid beneath their feet. I'll make arrangements this week, she said. I don't think it needs to be anything more than it is. She left the room. She climbed the stairs to her own bedroom, and she sat by the window and watched the fields, through the glass, and did not cry, which surprised her, and then did not surprise her, because she had been grieving this marriage for 3 years already, in the incremental and private way of someone who could not afford to grieve all at once. She was gone by the 1st of February, 3 days before her 30th birthday. The house on Kessler Road needed work. The kitchen had not been properly updated since her parents had first moved in, and the west-facing windows let in a draft that she initially tried to manage with heavier curtains, before conceding that curtains were not, in fact, the solution, and calling in a carpenter named Dewey Rains, who looked at the window frames with the professional dismay of a man who had seen worse, but not much worse. She had the kitchen redone. She had the windows reframed. She planted a kitchen garden in April, because her mother had kept one and she had always meant to, and because the act of putting things in the ground and expecting them back felt, that spring, like something she needed. She was busy in a way she had not been busy before, not the busyness of managing someone else's house, the constant low hum of invisible maintenance, but the busyness of her own making, which was a different animal entirely. She sent Percival Graves her ideas for the East Field, and he wrote back with suggestions she used and some she didn't, and they had a correspondence that was, in its way, more intellectually satisfying than any conversation she had attempted in 4 years of marriage. She was not happy, exactly. Not yet. But she was something. She was present in her own life in a way that felt new. She did not think much about James. This surprised her. She had expected to think about him constantly. The habit of his presence, the way 4 years of shared domestic space creates a texture in your mind that doesn't dissolve quickly. But her days were full enough, and her evenings were her own, in a way that she discovered she was not sorry about. She heard news of him, occasionally, through mutual acquaintances. The county's social circuits were what they were. She heard that he had closed the deal with the Braddock Company. She heard that he had made improvements to the North Fields. She heard from Mrs. Doris, who wrote her once with a formality that was the old woman's version of warmth, that the household ran somewhat differently without her, but that she had found a capable girl to help with the accounts. She wrote back to Mrs. Doris. She asked after the garden. The spring county meeting was the first public occasion she attended without the Mercer name serving as her primary social context, and she dressed for it with a particular care that she recognized, even as she was doing it, as a declaration of something. Not defiance. She was not given to defiance as a stance, more like intention. She sat beside Priscilla Ford. No, Priscilla was a name in the file. She sat beside a woman named Caroline Adwell, who was the wife of the county clerk, and who had sharp eyes and a quick way of getting to the point that Vivian found immediately refreshing. They discussed the drainage improvements proposed for the east roads. They discussed the timber contracts. They discovered they had nearly adjacent positions on the question of the river easement. Vivian walked home from that meeting with the sensation of someone who has just remembered that they are in fact interesting. James was there. She had known he would be. They spoke briefly, in the way of people who have agreed not to make things difficult. He was courteous. She was courteous. He looked, she thought, like a man who was holding something together by effort, rather than ease. She could not say whether she felt anything about this. She thought about it on the walk home, and concluded that what she mostly felt was something like clarity. She went home and wrote out her notes on the easement discussion, and had supper alone at the kitchen table, with the window open to the evening air and a book propped against the salt cellar, and thought, this is mine, this hour, this room, this life, this is mine. The letter from James came in October. It was not the letter she had expected. She had half anticipated something practical, something about the formal arrangement, some legal or financial matter requiring her attention. Instead, it was 2 pages in his handwriting, which was the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write carefully, and had never moved past the formal precision of that early instruction. He wrote that he had spoken at the County Land Association meeting, and had, In the course of explaining the Mercer estate's improvements over the past several years, found himself enumerating things that Vivian had done. The renegotiated feed contract, the corrected timber accounting, the management of the household that had allowed him to concentrate entirely on the fields for 4 straight seasons without once having to concern himself with the mechanisms of daily running. He had said it aloud, he wrote, before he understood what he was saying. And when he had finished saying it, there had been a silence in the room of the specific variety that arrives when a man has just told the truth he didn't know he was going to tell. I have been understanding, slowly, that I did not know you, he wrote. I do not mean this as I might have meant it 4 years ago, when I would have said it to indicate that you were difficult to know. I mean it differently now. I mean that I did not look. I had no good reason for not looking, and I am aware that this understanding arrives late, and that you are living your life with some success without requiring me to arrive at it at all. But I find I have to say it to you, even so. I would like to ask whether you would be willing to meet me, and whether you would prefer a public setting, which I understand completely, and which I will accept as the condition of your agreeing. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She went to the garden and pulled several weeds that did not require pulling, and then stood at the edge of the kitchen garden, looking at what she had put in the ground in April, and what had come back. She went inside and wrote him back. They met at the Whitmore Hotel, which was as public a setting as Savannah could offer on a Tuesday afternoon. She was there before him. She had ordered coffee and was reviewing a letter from Percival Graves about the East Field when James arrived. And she finished reading the letter before she looked up, not because she was trying to make a point, but because she had simply learned to finish things. He sat down. He ordered coffee. He looked as though he had also prepared something, and was less certain than he'd hoped to be about its delivery. She waited. You look well, he said. I am well, she said. A pause. I meant what I wrote, he said. I'm not here to. I understand that I don't have a claim to anything you haven't offered me. I understand that entirely. I just needed you to know that I understand it now. What I wasted. He stopped. What I chose not to see. She looked at him. She thought of the dinner table and the parlor in the winter that had lasted, in one form or another, for 4 years. She thought of the letter in her mother's kitchen, and the garden in April, and the meeting beside Caroline Adwell and the hour at the kitchen table when she had thought. This is mine, she thought. I have built something. It belongs to me. No one gave it to me, and no one can take it from me, and that is not something I am willing to trade. She also thought, which she had not anticipated thinking, that she was 30 years old, and James Mercer was the only person who had ever known her in the long and ordinary way of people who share the daily texture of life, even badly, even imperfectly, and that this was not nothing. I'm not moving back to the estate, she said. That is not something I'm considering. I know, he said. That's not what I'm asking. She studied him for a moment, the precision of him, the difficulty of him, the long effort of learning him over 4 years without ever being helped to do it. Then what, she said, are you asking? He met her eyes. He held them. To start, he said, over. The coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Outside, the street noise of Savannah carried on. Horses, carriages, someone calling across the road in the way of people who have known each other long enough to shout. She thought, I am not the woman who sat in that parlor on the floor beside her own grief and had no one to call, she thought. But I might, if I chose carefully, be something better than alone. Then you'll need, she said, to be patient. He nodded. Something in him settled, not in relief, she thought, but in something more like reckoning. The particular steadiness of a man who has accepted that what is being offered is exactly what he has earned, and not 1 degree more. I can do that, he said. She did not say, we'll see. She did not say, I hope so. She had become a woman who did not say things she was not prepared to mean. She picked up her coffee. She asked about the North Fields. He told her. She asked a question he had not expected, about the drainage gradient, and he paused and then answered it carefully, and she offered an observation from the county meeting that he turned over in silence before saying that she was probably right. It was not a love scene, exactly. It was something quieter than that, and, she thought, watching his face come back to her across the small hotel table, like something that had been away a long time, something she might, with enough patience and enough light, find a way to trust.